Right, here's a World at War. Now this is, I just got through doing the World in Flames Days of Decision, and one of the reasons I started that was I have this, and now Gathering Storm came out this year. I'm waiting yet another GMT. I haven't set everything up. Another GMT screw up on components regarding that game. But they've been having a lot of trouble with their packing and different things. And in this case, they gave me 2 of 1 chart. Apparently pretty common. Anyway. Why this is crazy is because usually I don't do a couple of monsters right in a row. And I can't guarantee I'm going to be doing this straight through. But I am in the mood to start with the exploration of the game. And like I did with World in Flames, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a small scenario or 2, actually definitely at least 2, get a feel for it, then maybe just dive in. Because unlike Days of Decision, I don't feel like Gathering Storm is going to be quite as confusing, although the rulebook is almost impenetrable until you get to like the end of the rulebook and it all starts to fall together. So the history of this game, and I feel kind of funny giving this here because this is sort of the intro to the land game, but you know, I'm not really that interested in trying to rationalize all my videos. I just expect everybody listens to everything I say. No, but, you know, whatever. The history of this game goes back to the old Avalon Hill Third Reich. And the old Avalon Hill Third Reich, you can still see the same design underlying this. Although, it's kind of funny, because when you're reading this rule book, you start, and maybe this was present in Third Reich, I don't remember. I haven't looked at that rule book in so long. My copy of Third Reich, I was so excited to get Third Reich back in, you know, I wasn't even in high school yet. I used to look in the catalog and say, oh yeah, I want that game. But it was a little more than some of the others, and so it was hard to buy. Anyway, eventually I picked it up, and I was so happy. The map was so beautiful, not as pretty as this one, and it looks kind of ancient now, completely out of date. And, you know, a hugely complex game. But I was young then and probably could tackle those kind of rules a little easier. Anyway, my copy of it ended up accidentally getting traded away for whatever squad leader stuff I have, and I'm sure my squad leader stuff's worth more just because people want, you know, the old hard maps from the expansions and stuff like that, whereas a 3rd edition copy of Third Reich is probably worth about $10. But it meant that I stopped playing Third Reich for a long time. At some point or another, my dad got me a copy of 2nd edition of Third Reich that he picked up for less than $1, I'm sure, and I never played it because I looked and said, well, that's 2nd edition. I still have the 3rd edition. Well, I had just kind of blanked out of my head that I don't have the 3rd edition anymore for like a decade or so. Somewhere in that period, I got an incredible deal on these guys. I don't remember what I paid. Like, they were out of print, but some teacher sold off all his war games to a gaming store that I liked. I think I got the pair of them for $30, or maybe even a little under $30. I don't remember. But you know, really fantastic deal. It was unpunched, etc. And I fell in love with the Advanced Third Reich Rising Sun combination. Now that's the next piece in the lineage. And really the big thing was Advanced Third Reich started adding to the old Third Reich, which was just a Europe-only game. It added some more detailed research system. Actually, I think the research didn't come out till Rising Sun, but it added more diplomatic situations so that diplomacy happened during the game. It still started in 39. And then Rising Sun came out, and that's going to be the Pacific map for A World at War. And as you can see, they're the same size maps, but, you know, this is all China. So like with World in Flames, they use a scaling differential with it. And that's reflected in this game. We can look at a Russian counter and see. Instead of giving different movement point costs for the hexes, God, I hate my Zoom. It's broken. You can see there's 3 numbers on here. Well, the first number is combat strength, the second number is movement, the third little tiny number down there is movement allowance on the Pacific map. So instead of having you have to look up really kind of complicated movement allowance costs that pertain to some of the maps in World in Flames, and you kind of end up just fudging it. Here, you have the movement allowance here, and you pay the normal movement point costs to move everywhere. I'm not sure which works better. I think the World in Flames one is more accurate, but it's also more effort. The downside of this, though, is, you know, German units can't go off onto the Pacific map. It's not a wholly integrated game, and there's a lot of issues where you can look at this series and say, wow, it kind of feels like they just kind of glued pieces on. And that's really what happened. They took the old Third Reich model and kept gluing new subsystems on. I think this version was meant to clean some of that up. It doesn't feel any cleaner to me than the Advanced Third Reich system did. And it's a significant decrease in component quality. Let's give you a little bit of a look there. So this is sort of becoming the whole. So first of all, these were old Avalon Hill counters, kind of thick. These things are wafer thin. I mean, these are about the thinnest commercially produced counters I've seen. Certainly much thinner than what GMT normally does in modern games. I've seen some of their older games that maybe have counters this thin. The game comes with a lot of player aids, but the old Third Reich and then the Advanced Third Reich have these little cards that handled, you know, the forces you had available, a little chart to track your money on. The economic system was probably getting too complicated for that. So instead what they did was they put out this huge booklet, which includes a lot of charts that you might need for the economic and for the diplomatic systems. Now I'm here thinking, what happened to these? They're sort of in here. And I'm still not sure if I have all the components. So this is, for example, France's equivalent to the German one here. And you can see here allowable builds, a little space for minor country units, isolated units. These are basically units that were destroyed. They're going to cost you more to rebuild if you do it right away. But the biggest thing is they add these naval construction charts to what you have. Now, the problem with this is, okay, look, European theater campaign game. Okay, that's fine. European theater campaign game. France and the US are on the same sheet. I have to photocopy this. Now, this is a somewhat heavier stock than the rule book or any other paper that's present in the game, except the player aid cards, which are a little heavier, which kind of sucks because, I mean, it's great that it's heavier stock, but it's useless that it's heavier stock. I can't just rip these out, and they're perforated so you can, and use them as is. So, for example, Russia and Italy and Germany, European theater campaign. There's not doubles. I checked that. And then some of these are also on the other side of some sheets that you probably would want to photocopy. So my feeling is that they gave me this heavier, harder stock and wasted money on it, because if I want to use any of that stuff, I got to photocopy at least half of the player aid cards. And by the way, these were thinner than the old ones that came in the original Third Reich. And now look at the color on the map comparatively. This map was so beautiful when it came out, and I still think it is. And part of me says I should just say screw it and use the old Advanced Third Reich map. I don't know if there are any differences, to tell you the truth. They're very similar looking, but I want to give this the experience with what it's got. But I find the colors, this also has some information in terms of, you know, look, the time track is only this big on here, but it covers everything you need, whereas this one covers, a big chunk of the map. So instead of some of this other information, like the combat results table and attrition table, well, where are they now? Well, they're in this pile of charts. There's also a copy on the back of the rule book, which is the more likely. I think they're on the pile of charts. No, there they are, attrition and combat results. There's also a copy here on the back of the rule book, which is the more likely to be used. And I think they're probably the same, although maybe they got bigger. So the combat results chart looks about the same size. The results are different. Okay, so I can't just use this game. I'd have to, refer to this chart anyway. And the same thing, the attrition table, you can see it goes to, it actually is a larger chart. So maybe there was some need to clear it out of there. It's also the case that the terrain effects chart, I was looking for that sucker. Expected to see it on the map or somewhere. Well, no. It turns out it's on the back of one of the booklets. And it's funny because the rules refer you to the terrain effects chart. And it's kicking around somewhere, maybe in the back. Yeah, here it is on the back of the scenario booklet. And it doesn't tell you in the rule booklet where to find it. It just tells you in the charts and tables. So I'm pawing through these because I just opened up my, I just sort of sorted through the cards in my Gathering Storm game and noticed that, hey, I have 2 copies of one card and no copies of another. Now here, and God knows if I have it, have everything, to tell you the truth. I've tried to sort through it. They don't give you a lot of information on it, but I have 2 copies of this naval combat chart. Now, if I look at the instructions as the manifest of what you're supposed to have, it says I'm supposed to have 4 of them. Well, maybe I'm supposed to have 4 of the naval status chart, but there's something very weird about this. And oops, I'm going to have to put those bagged units away. But anyway, another problem is the rule book itself. Look at this sucker. Now, I don't feel like the game has gotten tremendously more complicated. There's a little bit that's been added to it. It seems to me that the rule book has bloated well in excess of whatever new rules have been added. Most of it seems like it's just tinkering around the edges rather than huge new rule systems or anything. When I saw this thing, I expected I had a horribly new and larger game to learn. It's not the case. There are some differences, there's no question. But, it's incremental. What I do find horrible is the actual, well, first of all, when you bind a book like this, you're just asking it's going to split in half or in 3 pieces. If you've ever been a role player, we can look down here and see I have a bunch of these. Those are, all bound in the same way. Any kind of use for a rule book like this, or for role-playing books like this, any kind of regular use for it, like, 40 or 50 hours of playing like you would to play this game, and paging through the rules, I find those rule books just always split along the binder. So my guess is you don't even have a real rule book here. You're going to have to, get some holes in it and get it bound in some other way, which is a real shame. If they had been able to keep the rule book, maybe in multiple segments or whatever, because I think this is more expensive to put together. Anyway, the rules themselves, it's hard to tell because the old Third Reich rules were pretty damn bad. And I don't really remember these being fantastic, but I remember them being fairly clear and understandable. This one, it's somewhere in between. It's very, very verbose, hence the bloat. It may work well as a reference, and for some reason, this happened with Gathering Storm too. No page numbers. They don't want to tell me how many pages this is. I don't know what's going on. If this is some sort of, hey, make sure we get it all right because we have the date and the right time on it, because maybe, like I said, GMT's been having some component issues in the past couple of years maybe they, sent the wrong rule book to the printer or something like that, and they want to try to avoid that. So they're making sure they have someone, when that first copy comes out, that they have a number they can check it against or whatever on every single page. I don't know, I don't know how they could get to this point, but anyway, I find that kind of disturbing because I like to have actual page numbers on it. Page numbers may be confusing to people though, because there's an index, and the index is referred by the actual rule number. On the other hand, it's often easier to find something by the page number. So maybe, I don't know, but this is a monstrous size sucker. All right, so this is going to be the land introduction to the game. And what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be going over the rules that basically I need in order to play this Barbarossa scenario that I've got set up. I may have cheated on setup, don't worry about that too much. I caught myself not meeting the garrison requirements that I'm supposed to meet for the Russians, and I tried to fix it as much as I can, but I'm up close enough to the border, I'm not that worried about it, and my defenses are probably not terribly well designed. The main idea here is to learn what the different systems in the game are. So this is going to run several segments. I'm going to need breaks and such, so I'm going to take one of those breaks right now to put these back in the Third Reich box. Let's start. Some of the thoughts that I had about the rule book. One of the things is the rules in this don't really tell you a whole hell of a lot about what you're doing in sort of a broad overview. They say overview here, but that usually isn't very detailed in terms of giving you a real picture of what you're doing. And they also, there was something else I wanted to say. Anyway, the overview thing's a big deal because if you're tackling this for the first time and you're not used to Third Reich, you're going to feel kind of lost in some cases. And like I said, there are certain rules that are kind of hidden in here that I wouldn't have even realized had I not played Third Reich before, because you're reading repetitive things because of their verbosity, and you start skimming over and finding places where you're like, well, they're basically just reproducing information that's almost compendium information. So for example, a list of the amount of oil coming from each oil center, each thing taking its own line. Stuff like that you kind of say, well, gosh, that would be helpful in a player aid. But, there's so many player aids already. It's not a matter of, oh, wow, it would be, cheaper to put, or more expensive to put it on the player aid. I'm just worried about the massive overflow of information that's been ported over to these already, different charts and such. There's a lot here. Okay. But anyhow, the point being that you're going to feel kind of lost maybe if this is the first time you're looking at it, because that's a lot of rules to deal with in that case. I think the old Third Reich was just as bad. And so I've never approached one of the more complicated editions of it as a complete newbie to the system. Which means, of course, I'm drawing on experiences that I remember really struggling with the old Third Reich. So, this is just going to be heavier and more of a struggle, I think, for newer players to approach. And especially since things aren't completely integrated properly. Now, the old Third Reich was much worse in that Rising Sun had its own naval system that Third Reich didn't have. And of course, if you had both of them, and you were supposed to, you would sit back and say, well, why can't I just use that naval system over on Third Reich? And it turns out you can. That's what they did here. Okay. So let's find a sequence of play. There should be one of them over here. One copy of each one. Nothing overloaded here. And we'll see what we've got. And that's quite a hell of a sequence of play, right? But a lot of these steps are really broken out into minor little pieces. Once you get used to things, it might be helpful to have a smaller sequence of play. I made a smaller one over in Third Reich when I was playing that. I saw that in my stuff that I had that I just wrote out. Okay. So a lot of what we're doing here isn't really going to make a difference. We're not going to be seeing this in the Barbarossa. So let's look to see what rules we need for this. Ground and air combat, sections 1 through 19, unit construction, redeployment, Okay. Now, the problem is I can't really work through the rule book because I'm afraid to bend this cover beyond about here. And that's troublesome. One thing the game does not do, it gives you a nice glossary of all the different acronyms they use. It's not like they skipped using acronyms. They use them all over the place. It just didn't add up to enough when you repeat the rules again and again. And I really don't know how I feel about that. It makes it one hell of a reference manual. Because you don't have to search back for things. It must be a nightmare to maintain, though. A little bit of description of the map, which is fairly complex. The map board boxes, wow, that looks simple. Yeah, there's huge sections of rules on these suckers. Going into more detail, and I think they're repeated. They're inserted throughout the rules, so like, naval activity to and from each specific box has its own rules. Like I said, it's not a unified system. There's a lot of little patches here and there, and then the way that works is all specifically described. So World in Flames is able to, just say, okay, we got an arrow that goes from here to here, and arrows work a certain way. Instead of taking the effort to say that once, instead, basically, they say where this connects to, and where this box connects to, all in every single location where you might have to have that. Land movement, air movement, naval movement, blah, blah, blah. Every single one. So that's where you're getting some of this rules bloat from. But again, if you can wade through it, you will certainly find what you need in the first place you look, for the most part. We talked a little bit about the ground unit counters. You have your infantry, you have your armor. There's mechanized units, supposedly. I think only the U.S. has them or something. There's an odd thing here in this Barbarossa scenario, which is that there's Italian units here. Now, I have a memory from when I was reading the rules of something that struck me as completely incongruous, because I'm used to there being Italian units on the East Front, which was that Italy can't go to war with Russia. Okay, fair enough. And that they can't lend units to Germany, which doesn't sound at all reasonable, because this scenario, they have units lent to Germany. We'll see if I find that later on, but it's the kind of thing that really kind of disturbs me. Oh, by the way, when I just showed you the map, hey, they look similar enough. This one might look cleaner even than the other one because the colors are a little milder. But the texture of this is a glossy GMT map. The Avalon Hill one was a particularly nice, rich texture, very much like the Victory Games maps, although it lies a little flatter. It's not as poochy, but it had a nice grain to it that you could really kind of enjoy touching. It's the same stuff as the paper in the rule book. It's that slick, modern textbook paper that if you happen to get it damp, it's just ruined. It's like old paper would absorb water and then let it out. This stuff just gets damaged by it. I don't know what it is. But I presume this stuff is much, much easier to make thin, which is great for a rule book to some extent, but B, also a hell of a lot cheaper. I can't imagine that they went with anything but the cheapest way of printing that they could with this, given how they treated the rest of the components for the game. So one of the concepts you have is a counter availability concept, which fit with that little card I was showing you, and wherever they are over here, I don't know where they are. These little force pull sections, the allowable builds, you're going to have a certain limitation of units that you're allowed. The excess units are kind of kept in your counter tray. Some of the units, like the infantry, the armor, etc., are individual pieces that you really can't break down for the most part. Other pieces, like the air factors, are considered to be interchangeable. In fact, the air factors in this system get a little weirder than that. We can take a look at some Germans here. We not only have numbers 1 through 4, 1 through 5 of these air units, but they further break down into squadrons, and for that you can use the naval air squadrons, which I have kicking around here. Here they are, temporarily, if you don't have anything else to do it. Basically what happens is you notionally break each strength point of an air attack factor, or Army air factor, or whatever it's called, AAFs, to 3 squadrons. And that happens mainly when you're engaging in combat with naval air. But it can also happen when you're dealing with the force pool. So anyway, you have this force pool that you're able to develop, and you're going to be spending points, BRPs, which no longer are tracked on here. They're instead all going to be on paper. So they're your basic resource points. And you're limited to build what's in your force pool. Now, unlike with World in Flames, where you just get some force pool additions each turn, or each year, in this game, and unlike the original Third Reich, which worked very much the same way, hey, it's 1945, I get these new units. Well, no, it doesn't work that way anymore. You're going to have to research additional units, essentially. You have to build up your force pool by spending on them, and then you still have to spend on them to build them. We won't see how that works in this scenario, mainly because yeah, dealing with this rule book is just such a pain. I almost don't even want to deal with it because I can't let it lie flat. Okay. So then again, this is the whole sequence of play. We're up to section 9, which I believe was as far as we're supposed to go, or is it 19? Nah, 19. Okay. So the concept of an offensive operation. Offensive operations are broken up into different things, but they're basically things that you do with your counters themselves on the map. Now, some things don't require an offensive operation. So for air operations, basically fighting, doing air supply, air transport, these are going to these are going to require your unit to be used in an offensive manner. An offensive manner is going to do a couple of things. It's going to cost you BRPs, sort of. And then a number of different ancillary effects there. And ground support, sending the planes in to fight in a combat is going to cost you BRPs. Now the basic concept there is the game's divided up into fronts. And in Europe, you have an East Front, a West Front, and a Mediterranean Front. And the divisions are these red lines here to break them up. So the Mediterranean, I think the Mediterranean may actually break on the water. Anyway, in each front you have the opportunity to conduct offensive operations, and it essentially costs you 1 BRP to use one factor of units to do an offensive operation. So if I sent an air factor, to do a counter air action or whatever, that's going to cost me 1 BRP. Now that could build up very high, and you're beginning to think, if you've seen, say, Unconditional Surrender, which I covered, hey, I'm spending resources to move, to use my units. It doesn't work quite that way. You only spend on offensive operations, which are limited to mainly combat and combat support role, not for movement and the like. And then on each front, if you spend more than 14 BRPs, you max out at 15, and you're doing a full offensive operation. And that has some effects on the combats you can conduct, which is to say, if you're not doing a full offensive on the front, you're going to be allowed to use the back of the rule book. There's the attrition table that I showed you earlier. You're going to be allowed to use that for combat. Now, I'm not going to be able to show you the attrition table because I'm busy looking at the rule book unless I fish it out of that pile over there. Unlike the earlier versions of the game, these charts aren't easy to access. We're not going to touch offensive naval operations too much, but like the air ones, when you do certain specific things, you're going to pay. Now, for ground operations, if you're going to overrun an enemy stack, that's going to count as an offensive operation. And that's on a per factor basis. And also if you launch a ground attack, or if you do breakthroughs or exploitation. We're going to see that kind of stuff in action in this scenario. Some specified rules to handle crossing the front boundaries. You know, if you start on one side and move to the other, they've got to handle those kind of special cases. Isolated units can make an attack. That's if you're out of supply. I believe you're destroyed once you do so. Again, more special situations to undertake. Specific abilities of different units. Infantry is just pretty normal. These replacement points over here are essentially units that you can funnel in to absorb losses during attrition combat. So if somebody attrition attacks you and you take losses, you don't have to take them on the actual units that are on the front. You can reach back and hit your replacement centers and take those out instead. And that's all that they serve. They also serve as a strength point of garrison factor that can't move. Armor has some special capabilities, among others. They're the only units that have a zone of control. Now, the way the zone of controls work in this, yeah, they don't specify it here. They reference into it. So we'll get to the movement rules and see how they work there, because I don't remember if they're just a movement factor penalty. I know in the surprise turn attacking Russia, that's all they are. Airborne are going to have some ability to airdrop, and of course that's going to be very complicated rules that, you know, I'm going to skip over, both in describing and also the effectiveness. One thing that's neat about airdrops in this game, though, is you can use them to negate terrain features, and they're actually more powerful than they play out in the World in Flames environment that we just recently saw. I'm more impressed with them. Likewise, Marines can land. Commandos, they have special abilities. I don't remember what they are. We won't have those here. Flak is going to provide you with anti-air support. I think that may only be on strategic warfare. There are partisan units which are going to become available. Essentially, they're aligned with either the communists or the Western Allies, never with the Germans, and they allow you to build some units behind the lines, which can cause a little bit of disruption and a little bit of chaos. You're actually responsible for building them here. You've got you may have an automatic allotment, but you've got a limited supply of them, and then you can spend BRPs for the rest. All the different minor armies have their own force pools. They have also their own counter mix per country, which that was something that gave me, you know, some serious happiness when Advanced Third Reich came out, because the old version had just generic counters, and it's much, much neater when you have you know, lots of different ones. Obviously, things like the minor Axis allies, because they're conducting offensive operations and not just something that gets beat up right at the beginning of whatever war they're on and is knocked out. They had their own countermix always, and they still do. And you can see the different colors in that Axis line. Okay. Is this, we're in 11 here. What is 11? 11 is just the partisans rule. So we're going to kind of ignore that. They have their own kind of supply lifetime and et cetera. And we'll touch on them, but they're going to affect this scenario, but it doesn't seem worth the effort to look too heavily into them. They control the hex they're in. Okay, stacking limitations. The basic stacking in this game is going to be 2 ground units in a hex, but you're also allowed air units up to the basing factor. Each city can base 5 factors of Army Air Force. Each air base counter, which are these things, and you have a limited supply of them, can also hold 5. And you could be in a hex with, like, you know, the capability to hold 10 or even 15 of these. I think you're only allowed 1 air base per hex, and I still haven't set up all my Russians. Mainly because I don't know where this factory is supposed to go, but there's some Italians I haven't set up either. Oops. Okay. In addition to your air and naval units, which also have a limitation, ports are these little circles. Naval units will be able to base in those. You're able to have 3 additional special units in there. The special units are things like paratroopers, commandos, marines, and on top of that, you're also allowed to have, I think, 3 factors of ACAC or FLAC, which I have in here somewhere, but I can't see it. There's some Russian ACAC. And that's pretty much the limit of that. There are special cases, though, such as beachheads or bridgeheads, which can actually occur across rivers, or they can happen on sea invasions or across straits. Breakthrough hexes. I'm trying to think. There are others as well, where you're allowed to overstack, and sometimes for a long time. I gotta cut this video because I'm out of juice. Okay, so we're getting our way to 19. Talked about stacking. And again, there's special cases on all of this. Movement, there's actually not too much exciting here. You pay a movement point per hex cost, somewhere probably on the back of here. A couple of these things. Ground units expend an extra movement factor in swamps. I'm not seeing mountains. Which certainly have an effect. Aha! Yeah. Okay. So forests and extra movement factor. So you basically have a series of these little terrain objects charted on here as is usual. One notable thing on the map, these are your objective hexes, and this is what you'll be rated for in a lot of the scenarios. If you can hold a certain amount by the end of the scenario or whatever, you get, you know, your victory judged on that. What about overruns? 2 armored or mechanized infantry. Through the same hex side, you have to have odds of 6 to 1 or greater. Now, I believe that takes into account the terrain modifier for the hex. which we'll touch on when we get to combat. Now, do you have to pay a movement point cost for this? I believe you do. There's no special. Yeah. Yeah, so the terrain has an effect on overruns, which makes it pretty hard to overrun stronger units in any kind of terrain, really. Okay. So then the next jump is to attrition combat. And attrition combat is something kind of, I gotta fix the map, it's off, kind of specific to the Third Reich system that you won't see many other places. So let's grab our table here. The way it's handled is you count up the number of factors, combat factors, ground factors, adjacent to the enemy. But these can't be factors that you've done any offensive actions with. If you've done any offensive activities with them, i.e. and paid your BRPs for them, you won't be allowed to roll on the attrition table. And you make a roll, there's some modifiers here. One of the modifiers is this concept of CTL, combat tactical level. This is something that is new. I think it's in A3R, but it's not in the original Third Reich, which is that certain nations are going to have better armies than others in general. Now, the game doesn't go hog wild on this. Generally, most of the major powers have a CTL of 2, and and some of the minor powers have a CTL of 1. So, anyway, it does have an effect on the attrition table, and this is going to be expressed in results that are counters lost and hexes lost. And the attacker makes a roll, and he can point to certain hexes that he's adjacent to and force the defender to fall out of them. And then the defender takes the counter losses more or less as he wishes, and that can include running back along a supply line to grab, say, a garrison unit or a weaker unit that's in the same theater. And in fact, it can go outside of the theater. For example, if you're in North Africa and you have to trace your supply back to Italy, you can actually take garrison counters, replacement counters, whatever, off of that theater, as long as that's where you're drawing your supply from. There are restrictions on what hexes can be taken. You can't take like an important hex, basically, is what it comes down to. Objectives, factories, economic areas, stuff like that. Now, economic areas are actually noted on the map. This is also an A3R idea. So, for example, Berlin itself is worth 50 BRPs. Essen's worth 25. That way, if you lose part of your country due to an invasion or something, you're going to lose some points. Now, Russia doesn't really have economic locations, although I think Vladivostok is one, and there's one up here somewhere, I think. I'm not sure. Maybe it's in Siberia. Russia has these ICs, which basically give them the opportunity to move their economic centers away from the front, as they did historically. Okay. Actual offensive combat is going to be done through ground attacks, where you don't have to attack. And remember, you pay BRPs to make an attack. But if you go over that 14 BRPs, you cap out at 15, but you're no longer allowed to use the attrition table at all on that in that theater. So you might have a limited offensive you want to do, for 10 factors of combat units, maybe an overrun or something like that, and then do an attrition combat. Remember, though, the units that you used for offensive actions, you can't add into your attrition value. Now, one of the keys to this is that the defender has a defensive multiplier. And essentially, as long as you're CTL2, you have a base defensive multiplier of +2. What that means is even if I'm attacking you out in the clear, you're going to be doubled compared to what the attacker has for strength. There are some cases where lower CTL get reduced, facing exploiting tanks and such not. You get additional bonuses for situational stuff like an invasion or terrain. Fortresses give you a heavier plus. Note we have on the board fortresses in this game. Even over in Gibraltar, boy, that was a shock in World in Flames that Gibraltar wasn't a fortress. Not only do they give you the die roll modifier, but they also give you a benefit in terms of the results and mandatory exchanges and such not. And what's going to happen is you come up with a base odds factor round in favor of the defender. Always make a roll and you get a result. Now the results are a little different in this from the old Third Reich, which used to have attacker eliminated, defender eliminated, exchange, and there may have been a retreat result. I don't think so though. This is Avalon Hill originally. So an A indicates that you have to lose the capital A here, an amount of factors equal to what the defender had as their total defensive value, including terrain, etc. A little a is half that. D's work the same way. The defender loses everything or half of everything. There's several exchange results on here. The base exchange is the smaller total combat factors loses his entire force, and the larger side has to lose at least that many factors. Now you're allowed to take air and, if it's available, naval support for this. That's generally a bad idea because air and naval points are more expensive, but at least than infantry. Exchange -1, the defender loses everything. I think it's a -1. The attacker loses as many factors as the defender, but you reduce the defender's defensive multiplier by 1 for that. And likewise, the exchange -2, I guess, is you reduce the defensive multiplier by 2. So now you no longer have these plain, one side eliminated, the other side eliminated, or one side eliminated and the other side mauled. You have some lesser results to take into account in there. It's still a pretty simple CRT though. But notice this, rounds of combat. That's a modifier that goes in favor of the attacker. If your CTL is high enough, and I think it's 3, you're allowed to fight, and this is new, you're allowed to fight more than 1 round of combat. So after fighting 1 round of combat, if both sides still have forces left in the 2 hexes, the attacker can continue fighting if he's allowed to by his CTL, which I don't really want to push this. A 1 or less is only 1 round of combat, 2 is a 2nd round of combat, 3 is a 3rd round of combat, and so on. And note that you get a bonus the more you press the defender, so if you get that high tactical level, you're going to be able to hit again and again and again. And one of the problems with Third Reich in the original version was you'd hit a hex, you'd eliminate it, you'd get your advance, but if you didn't have with these more limited results, I guess the big difference is with these more limited results, you don't get the decisiveness of the attack that you necessarily would. So they factored this in as a way to give those more decisive results you're used to, but they've broken the combat rounds, or the combat into multiple rounds, so that higher quality units can actually achieve those better results. As I think quickly to try to make that up. Okay. And then you're allowed to advance into an empty hex. Great. Okay, one of the things in this game, and I'm not going to be able to explain the naval rules this way unless I don't know what's going to happen because I haven't played them. So, but one of the things that happens is if you have an armored factor involved in the attack, and I think it has to advance, then you get this. You get the opportunity to put here a breakthrough marker on top of that armored factor. And then any armored factors that were adjacent to attacking units can all be sucked into that hex, and they're going to be breakthrough units. And they're allowed to move using their movement allowance and forming a chain of units. And there's restrictions to the chain. Basically, it's a space in between each unit to push further in. And they get marked with these exploitation markers. There are some potential little tweaks to the exploitation, some advantages. For example, the Germans going into Poland get an advantage in exploitation combat. I think maybe even France. We passed that rule by. But one of the biggest factors of this is not only do you get this chance, these are units that didn't attack originally, but now they get this additional chance to push in deeper and attack. And I've kind of set up my armor in a second row so that I can take advantage of that roll. So not only do you get that chance to push deeper in an attack, but those units that are marked with the exploitation marker are going to also be in supply through your next turn, which means even if they get cut off and isolated, like we see happen all the time over in Hitler's war, they're considered in supply so they can fight their way out of it pretty easily. So trying to pocket them becomes a really useless endeavor. Pocketing other types of troops that advance is easy, but they're not, or is effective, but they're not as likely to be stuck out on a limb as these guys are. Okay. Phew. Air operations. So there's a number of different things you can do with air units. Some of these are really naval operations more than anything else. You're going to have jets, which are particularly effective in air-to-air combat. Available, of course, you have also your strategic bombers, which are used in the strategic warfare, which there's Atlantic SW. Basically, there's a couple of different places in the game. The Indian box, and then I think there's a full Pacific one where you're able to complete strategic warfare attacks within them. And that's an attempt to knock down the economic capability of the enemy. We won't be facing that in this scenario. Okay. Basing limits for air units, I've already talked about that. It's 5 per base value for the most part, with cities being a base and with the little air base counters being a base. Air unit can stage up to twice its range, and this isn't going to tire it out. Now, like in WIF, when you use an air unit for some kind of offensive operation, it's flipped over. And it may get flipped over through enemy counter-air actions. This is, again, handled differently very differently from the way the old Third Reich did. One thing you'll notice is there's an air combat table. This came out in A3R. So the old Third Reich used to just be this kind of numeric deterministic system where, oh, I got more than you, you take these many hits. But the new system works by comparing the air factors to a die roll, and there's some modifiers in effect, and then you do some damage to the enemy that way. Looking for interception, but I don't know if there is in here. Yeah. We can intercept defensive air support. You can intercept either air support, can't you? Maybe not. Maybe only defensive. Because the defensive air support is going to be adding, to the defender's strength in the hex. And we'll talk about that in a bit. But that becomes a very potent use of air power. So since those units may be further away than you can reach with your counter air, you have to be able to hit them when they go in with the defensive air support. Okay. So here's a list of the offensive actions and counter air, air supply, air transport, and the different supports and the interception are what we're going to be worried about. All right, we're going to break for a while because I need to switch batteries. And it really sucks because I'm not going to be able to jump in and play. But to another extent, I don't really remember the air rules all that well. They've changed so significantly, and there is some complexity to them now. So maybe I'll actually look at them again. It's not that I haven't read the rules, it's just this is a lot to remember. I think I resolved, at least in my own mind, what the rules intend to mean here. The rules are very sparse and they don't give you a lot of context, so sometimes it's hard to determine what they mean. For example, the BRP limit, hitting that 15 limit, I would have never caught that when reading these rules if I didn't remember the Third Reich had this, eventually you hit a full offensive action and you stop having to pay and you can move all your units. You have this choice between, I'm going to spend a little bit because I have a hex I really want to take, and maybe an objective or something, and then all the rest of my units take an attrition because it's cheap, it doesn't cost me anything, it doesn't cost me any losses. My opponent's attrition might. But anyway, that rule, I found one line that contains it. And here, there's one particularly convoluted little piece that led me to think that air combat works completely differently from how it should. And now I think I understand how it works. So in the counter air in particular, what's going to happen is you fly your plane by its range, number of hexes, and that range I believe can be extended with research. A number of hexes, so here I could hit this, 1, 2, 3, 4, against enemy planes. Then I'm going to fight several rounds of air combat. Now, in each of those rounds, whether the defender's flipped or not, he still gets to fight with all his planes. The results from the air combat are, so each of us looks up how many air factors we have, rolls 2 dice on here, applies any modifiers, and gets a two-number result. The numbers to the left of the slash are how many enemy plane units I've destroyed. The number to the right is how many have been aborted. Now, for the counter air in particular, though, because the defender, even flipped units get to fight, this is kind of weird. You don't flip the enemy's units, actually, by getting these hits, unless it's the last round of the counter air. This is the particular line that it made it sound like nothing happens, but it's only in counter air, and it prevents you from being able to knock out the entire defender's air force over a couple of rounds of combat. So you choose your round when you want to disengage, and presumably you'll have flipped all the enemy planes by that Your own units, as the attacker that abort, have to fly back to their base. And there they end up aborting. In general, interceptions can't be intercepted, but there's one exception to that, which is when you've got air transport that's intercepted, you can actually send other planes to intercept the interceptors. Now you might be saying, well, now wait a minute, why is that different from, say, strategic warfare? Okay, the reason is because there's a whole different system in place for strategic warfare, and we're not going to worry about that at this point. There is some possibility, though, that there'd be air transport or air supply, and those have a possibility of that interception of an interception. One of the interesting things to this is the ground support for both the attacker and defender is quite high. In World in Flames, we were finding air power really didn't do you all that much good, as you could essentially match the amount of factors of strength points you had in battle with the amount of air factors you had. So if you really wanted to get significant effects with it, you had to do things called ground strikes. And those were pretty iffy and not very effective, in my opinion, at least early in the war. In this, you're allowed to pump in 3 times as much air power in strength as you are land power. Now, this usually doesn't matter. You're not going to, if I'm attacking with a bunch of these stacks of, 6 or 8 strength points, I'm just not going to have that kind of air power. But it does mean that smaller forces can be really significantly bolstered with air, and for that matter, naval power. So that's what we have to say about air operations. And that's the end of 19. So now we go back to what we need for Barbarossa. And construction, redeployment, hex control. All right. 27, 28, 29, 30, 31. They didn't decide to just give us 27. I'll just say 35. All right. Let's try to be careful with this rule book because I know it's going to fall apart. The rest of this is naval operations. That's okay. Now I can lay it on the binding. Okay. Construction costs. Units cost essentially per factor they have. Now there's some things that just have a cost. For example, declarations of war, doing an offensive. But offensives also cost, if they're limited offensives, 1 point per factor that's involved in the offensive. I didn't talk too much about unflipping units. We'll get to that in a little bit, but essentially you're going to be using, like in World in Flames, oil to unflip your air or naval units. But here's what's neat about this game. You can do it at any time. So World in Flames had, you get to unflip at the end of your turn. And the old Third Reich had that. Now, I don't think oil existed in this manner in Advanced Third Reich. So this is kind of a new factor, and it's oil's a key component to this war. So I think it's very cool that they're handling it this way. It's kind of like one thing I mentioned with World in Flames was there's this bouncing back and forth of ideas between the two games. Third Reich came out; it inspired the whole genre of the strategic complex war game for World War II. World in Flames came out saying, let's do it in detail and really get the military down. And then over time, Advanced Third Reich came out almost as a response to that. And hey, let's get both theaters in place with Rising Sun. And then the oil effects came out in World in Flames. And now they're added here. I think Third Reich's always been kind of lagging behind WIF in a lot of ways in terms of the innovations. But it is the game that did diplomacy and technological research earlier. In fact, tech research, unless It's not in what I have for World in Flames. Anyway, let's take a look at what else costs. So building units. You're allowed to build units at a certain point in your turn, probably towards the end of the turn. Unit construction down here. And you pay per factor to do so. So airplanes, boats, specialized units, they're going to cost you 3 BRPs per factor. Armor and partisans cost 2, and your infantry and replacements cost 1 each. Naval air also only costs 1 each. But remember, naval air is in squadrons, and they're a third the size of the ground air units. Other things that cost, fortifications and railheads. Now there's railheads in this, but I don't have any deployed. I have fortresses on the map. Beach defenses, which are these things giving you additional defenses against invasions. Invasions can't be done anywhere. They can only be done on the beaches. We'll get that when we do the naval rules, I hope. And building new ports. Okay. If your unit falls under certain conditions, like it was isolated when it was destroyed, or you voluntarily removed it from the map to rebuild it this turn somewhere else, it's going to have a doubled cost to be rebuilt. Those units, if they cycle out of production for a turn, though, go to your normal force pool where they'll cost normal. If you have both effects, you're tripled. Specialized units can't be sped up at all. They have to cycle through a turn. You have limits on your construction, which are going to be determined by your economic power. And you'll only be able to spend, I think it's a third of your total BRPs in any given turn on construction. The old Third Reich had you could only spend half your points on a given turn. Well, that prevented you from taking offensive sometimes. So this makes things a little bit more reasonable. You've got the effects of some of the strategic stuff is baked into here. It's also elsewhere. And the units are going to be able to be placed in, I believe, your home country. It doesn't have to be cities in this. And then there's all kinds of special rules for Commonwealth and such not to handle that. Naval construction has its own special set of rules that I don't fully understand yet. Okay, then you come to the concept of redeployment. Now, in the old Third Reich, there was strategic redeployment, which just allowed you to, move a certain number of units anywhere basically you could trace a line. They've broken that up into different types: naval redeployments, strategic redeployment, and a tactical redeployment. The naval redeployment is really just a redefinition of the old Third Reich rules, which was if you're making a transit across water, you have to support it with fleet elements. And we won't worry about that at this point. Maybe we'll never really get to it. But tactical redeployment is something where you're allowed to move your units, their movement allowance, again, basically. The restriction is you can't do this so that you can't end up or start next to an enemy unit when you do any kind of redeployment. So what that kind of means is you have this kind of flexibility to shift things along the front without doing your full strategic redeployments. That's helpful because the strategic redeployments can only be done from specific points. And I believe those are cities. which means you can tactically redeploy to get yourself to where you can do a strategic redeployment. And oh, I'm sorry, it has to be an objective or map board box. So what this allows you to do basically with the tactical redeployment is move a unit like this, armor unit 1, 2, 3, 4 to Budapest, and then I can do a strategic redeployment to an objective hex. And these all kind of interleave, so there's like the possibility of naval redeployments. So you can do a tactical redeployment, a strategic redeployment, a naval move, and then do another tactical to get off the objective hex or whatever that you ended up at. And then there's special rules for handling the off-board boxes. They're also handled in the movement rules. Essentially, they're just connected to the map at a certain point. Hex control. Okay, one interesting thing here is when you isolate a pocket, it slowly collapses one hex circumference at a time, or one hex of radius at a time, until it falls completely under your control. Units that are isolated and out of supply will die off, with one exception that I can think of, which is if you're in a fortress, you don't automatically die. But what happens is you start picking up these isolation markers, which reduce the effectiveness of the fortress defensively. You can attack with units that are isolated, but they have a disadvantage in that they're destroyed after the attack, whether it's successful or not. Talk about different types of supply. There's limited and unlimited supply sources. Your unlimited supply source is basically your home country capital. Limited supply sources would be minor countries that don't connect back. And the difference there is really, at least for ground units, it turns these suckers into only infantry units. So they no longer move faster, your armor and such not. They no longer move fast, and they also lose some of their combat strength. They fall back down to 3/3s. I don't know about the 2/6 armor. It may turn into a 1/3. There's probably specifics about all that. And here they enumerate all the different supply sources and every sort of way that you can get supply. The actual line is just that you can't trace it through enemy units or enemy zones of control. There's a lot of special cases on this. You determine supply, let's see, during your movement phase, after you move the air units, counter air attack, whatever. And then also after combat, you have to check supply. Now remember that exploiting armor does not, it remains in supply until the player's next turn. Bridgeheads, when you cross a river, which is what's going to happen here, or make an invasion, you're going to have some additional stacking capability, and it also becomes sort of a supply head. It's an unlimited supply source for the turn that you get there, and you can trace supply to it even if you don't have a port, but you do have to use naval traces. The effects of fortifications, okay, so you're able to construct these and they have a certain cost, whatever. But their effects, among others, if I miss any, I say that, right, is you have to have at least 1-to-1 attack odds after all modifiers are taken into place. And if things get kind of screwed up later, I think you're destroyed for failing to maintain that 1-to-1. You also get additional defensive modifications based on the fortification type, etc. And when you attack using an offensive operation against a fortification or even a fortified hex, under certain circumstances, beach defense. You automatically get an EX result if you got better, right? The attacker always incurs, let's see, the attacker always incurs an EX minus 1, EX minus 2, or EX minus 3 at the defender's option, as detailed in something. And this is going to be based on the attacker's CTL and the defensive modifier of the attack tax. There's basically a little chart back on that space in that rule that shows you where it is. I don't feel like looking it up while I'm doing a rules description. It's not that exciting. Okay, and then we have different types of fortifications here. Okay, oil is a big deal. What about oil? Oil is produced in certain places, little production spaces. And you have lists of the production. So Plaste has 3. They don't decide to put that on the board. Instead, it's written here, and maybe in some, other place. It's earlier in the rules as well, but it may also be on a player aid card. Unfortunately, it's not written on the map in a way that you can see it. And so other things like Grozny are only 1. Oh, wait, it is there. Ooh, excellent. My eyes just couldn't see it. So there's got to be a little 3 here. Excellent. Okay. Yeah, that would really kind of piss me off if I had to look it up here. And oil is produced in those locations. During the turn, you're going to be allowed to use oil. And there are various things you can use it for. One of them is unflipping units. And then once you use however much oil you use during the turn, at the end of your turn, you can stockpile the oil. But there's a limit to what each country can stockpile. And you have sort of a national reserve of oil. If you have leftover oil after that, you don't stockpile it anymore. You throw it out. Oil can be damaged or affected by partisans by losing the space. I think it can probably be dealt with by bombing too, but I don't see anything about that. So the actual oil counters can be used to offset oil effects. In each turn you're going to have a requirement if you're in a certain situation with your oil, where you take certain oil effects if you don't produce enough, if you don't expend oil. For the Russians, once they're invaded and they lose something, I don't know what, they undergo oil effects. For the Germans, if the Nazi-Soviet pact no longer exists, we're going to phrase it that way because of Gathering Storm. In a straight game of a world at war, it's once Germany goes to war with Russia, they're no longer getting their huge supplies of resources from Russia, so, and that included some of their oil. So then they have to actually look to their oil and spend some to offset certain oil effects that they'll get. Those oil effects affect their movement capabilities, and it also affects their production capabilities, and it's pretty heavy. They have to spend like 5 oil to get rid of all those effects. Now, there's special rules for handling everything here. So for example, India, Australia, South Africa, which is under the rule book, all have their own room to keep oil in. They don't necessarily produce oil, but they have a certain amount of room to keep oil in. The United States, when it comes around to it, is an unlimited supply of oil at all times. So as long as you can ship enough oil to all the locations you want to stock it in, you're fine. And here's a list of the different oil effects. It has a penalty, so like air units lose a DRM level, and they have other restrictions and penalties applied to them. Naval units also are going to get the DRM penalty. Army units will lose a CTL. and they can't do a lot of things. They also go to limited supply in terms of the armor units become just infantry, and they become weaker and slower. Okay, now we were talking about uninverting units. So each oil you expend can uninvert 25 of your land units during your turn. But there are certain uses you're not allowed to do that with. Now, you automatically get to uninvert your units at the beginning and the end of your turn, which means you get to get them inverted during the opponent's turn and during your own turn, and you get a free recovery. But beyond that, you have to spend oil, and you can do that at any point. So you can say, look, I did my counter errors, now I want to do ground strikes. I got fuel, I can do that. Of course, you might have taken losses in between. Restrictions on the uninversions. Weather should be in here. Yeah. Okay. So there's two types of weather in the game. There's mud and there's winter. These are sort of automatic. There's going to be mud in the spring in Russia. There's going to be winter in the autumn, I think, and in winter in Russia. Winter restrictions, no, only in winter. Okay, but there's a winter table, which is here, which is going to be involved with rolling a die and taking certain modifiers. Now, there's a Russian winter zone, which I'd have to find the definition for it. There's also winter preparation table, which can reduce how badly the winter affects you. And all countries start off with values. Russia's at the highest possible value of 6. So are countries like Finland and Sweden that are involved in that. And what automatically increases if they fight in the winter in Russia or whatever, the Axis gets to learn how to prepare without having to do any kind of research work or anything on it. Do we have to do economics? We do have to do the year start sequence. Okay. I think I need to stop for the night. When I look into the economic system a little closer, it turns out I lied to you, but we'll cover that in a moment. It involves the ICs. You can't move these suckers. That I was confusing with WIF. And that really disturbs me because to some extent the Russians did pull up factory capital, as it were, and move it to the east. However, had they not been attacked, they would have been able to probably keep a building pace. So it actually has there's a rationale for why it works the way it does. Okay, so let's hit economics. The old Third Reich used a certain economic system, and it's still here in essence. The old one used a little track with numbers on it. Here you're going to be doing it all on paper. Presumably, I still haven't bothered sorting out all the bucks. What happens is each country is rated at the beginning of the game with a starting value, and Gathering Storm is going to affect that. And that starting value is the number of BRPs that you start the scenario with, and that'll pay for your offensives and building new units. But at the beginning of each year, you have to reset that starting value. And essentially what happens is you get an amount equal to the sum of your key economic areas, and you're rated for those in the base game. We'll talk about how Gathering Storm affects it later. Plus any conquests, minor countries, stuff like that. That's all added into your BRP. But as the game goes on, you have a growth potential. So you have a BRP base which reflects the territories that are actually considered part of your country. And in the case of, say, Germany, it includes Czechoslovakia and Austria. Even though those were recently added, they got integrated in the economy in a way that, say, the conquest of Poland did not. And if you have remaining money at the end of the term, at the end of the year, you get a percentage of that added to your base. And in the case of Germany, it's 50%. So there's a strong reason to try to keep your economy growing. You know, the guns and butter question perhaps is being reflected here, so that you can fight this long war. However you want to argue that, I'm not sure that the growth rates are applicable, but they also used to include the concept of militarizing the economy. Now that's handled through a different mechanism, which we're not going to touch on here. That's mobilization. Well, we better. It's not covered in this scenario. But the way mobilization happens is certain events come into play, and I think your base increases. Let me see. Yeah, it increases your base, it increases your current BRPs, and it also is going to throw some additional forces into your force pool each time you hit a mobilization event. Now, we're not going to have any of those in this scenario, but I wanted to give kind of a feel for that because we're covering the economics here. We also have this scorched earth, which is simply a way of saying, as you're leaving an area that has a BRP value, you can declare that you destroyed it, and you end up losing, I think, the BRP value from the area. Whatever you got for the area for that year is lost on a prorated basis. Every time you gain or lose territory in A3R, you get a prorated portion of what its economic value is. So in this case, you know, let's say I was in Hungary and half the year had gone by, and I decide to scorch earth Hungary, I lose I'd lose all 10 BRPs because I collected them. And then when somebody captures it, they lose 0. So that's not really an issue. The scorched earth takes place from the beginning of the year, I believe. It should not be. Let me make sure. Maybe it's prorated instead. I'm not seeing. Oh yeah, no. You eliminate the rest of the year. So if I had gotten 10 points from Hungary and halfway through the year I decide to scorch earth it, I lose the 5 remaining points. But if I'm abandoning it anyway, I will lose those points anyhow, and my opponent will gain them. So I just deny him the points for that year. Okay. So now we get to industrial centers, and these are unique to Russia. And what they do is they provide a different formula for how growth is calculated for Russia than for anyone else. In the old Third Reich, A3R added this concept, Russia just had a 20% growth rate. They still have a 20% growth rate, but apparently they didn't ever have enough of an economy to please people, you know, to appear to show what people thought they should. So they added this extra pile of points that they generate. So Russia actually has a very small base that grows at 20%, and then they have these suckers which grow based on the German attack. When the Germans attack, they start out at 10 points each and they don't grow. But after the Germans attack, they start increasing to 15s and then 20s. Now, if the Germans capture one of them, it reduces down to 5, and it's fixed at that for the rest of the game. And these can be captured and recaptured, and they're given back and forth prorated. They count as limited supply sources, and they also count like objective hexes in that you can't take them from attrition combat. Key economic areas are part of your BRP base. So, for example, over here, Leipzig is worth 25 of Germany's initial BRP base. And I believe, yeah, I don't know. Anyway, they can be captured and recaptured, and they're worth value to the capturer. Okay, spending limits. Okay. So there's a special restriction for China. But essentially you have a construction limit, which is 1/3, I talked to you about this before, of your current BRP at any given time that you can spend on construction. There's systems by which players can give BRPs to each other. The hardest situation, and there's special rules for each of these, like channeling goods through India, through South Africa is the more applicable. But here, there are a couple of routes that are available to reach Russia. And these are actually, I believe, pre-programmed in the Barbarossa scenario. So if I'm sailing stuff in through Murmansk, there's actually chances for the Axis to intervene with that. If I open up the Persian route, which costs some BRPs for the Brits to do, it won't in Barbarossa, it'll just be automatically handled, they start channeling goods up through here. And as I said, special rules for all of these. Turkey, if it's Allied control, can also be used as a route to send. And there's a limit of how many points you can send by each of these routes. So Russia only gets, a certain amount of points granted to them, even in the Grand Campaign. All right, now we're going to jump over to Russian surrender. All right, we're going to have to pause this so I can try to figure out how to cope with this rule book. There's not much left here because there's not a lot of all right, whatever, video. I'm eating up the video and whatever. All right, so Russian surrender is going to be determined by adding up a bunch of modifiers and minuses. Essentially, there's a bunch of different things, and not all of them are going to affect us in this scenario. Things like firestorms, I don't think can happen here. And if the value of the Russian resistance is calculated out to be 0 or less, and that's through conquests and such not, Russia will surrender. Germany can reject that, and then the two countries continue at war, but you keep checking. Russia will still keep offering surrenders as long as it's in place. If Russia does surrender, well, a whole bunch of specific political rules take place. And we're not going to go too much into this because what I want to tell you is each country has these. I don't want to go into details with each one. Every country has its own special rules to surrender and its own special rules as to the effect of surrender, every major country. And it just makes a mess out of the game. Mainly all you need to know here is the surrender for this scenario is you have to look at that chart to do the surrender values and figure them out. Now let's take a look at minor allies, 85. And let's put my... Okay. Now this handles how alliances can happen. We're not going to go into that. That's the diplomacy rules. We're not really worried about that. What I'm worried about is actually how you can use them. And essentially, you get their forces. The units of a major power, its major power allies, its minor allies, and associated minor countries may stack together. Well, you know, that's the level of nailing things down these rules try to do. One would just assume you could, but I think maybe in prior versions you couldn't. Each minor ally has its own limitations to where it can go. So like the Bulgarians are not in this scenario because they're not allowed to attack Russia. They can only be in Albania, Greece, and European Turkey. Now that, as well as any Balkan minor country that's enemy or conquered, which allows them to serve as garrisons in Yugoslavia, which is what they're historically doing. But these guys are all going to be allowed to go deep into Russia. Yeah, wait, maybe only in Romania is allowed deep in Russia. Nope, they're allowed in. Okay. And the Finns have a limitation of their own here. And of course, this is going to be repeated in the individual country lists as well. Russian Hexen is adjacent to the Finnish border. They're not going to be allowed to go deep. And that's really about all there is. We don't have to worry about, in the big game, they can be diplomatized, and they can actually switch sides there. And that's all I'm going to worry about with that. Now, when we look into the Barbarossa scenario itself, there's going to be some limited naval capacity. You can do certain invasions, sea supply and sea transport, and there's going to be some notional destroyers up in the Baltic Sea to help support that. But I don't want to go into the full naval rules and explanation of them. So I'll probably actually kind of just gloss over that. Look them up, play them as needed. And if we have any situation where they do take place, which is unlikely if I only play the first year, well, an invasion's possible, I guess. We'll end up just waiting until we do a naval scenario to fit that in. I'm going to load this up. It's taken longer than I expected. The rule book is more painful than I possibly imagined, just in terms of its physical construction and its layout, its repetitiveness. It is its inability to convey major concepts, instead giving them to you, you know, in all these little tiny chunks of instances of the rule, you know. And there's no overviews. They try to give you overviews, but they just fail completely. But I don't remember, honestly, whether or not, I know the original Third Reich sucked in terms of rules. It was very much this style, and I think Advanced Third Reich wasn't far from this. I remember, maybe misremember, thinking to myself, wow, I'd have a hard time, you know, playing this without having played Third Reich before. It just keeps getting worse and worse. It's a matter of that old Avalon Hill style, and they've cleaned it up a lot, but it is not designed to teach people rules. In this particular case, it appears like it's going to work as a very good reference, which is not always the case. Third Reich, I remember looking for things and never finding them, and whatever. Anyway, let's send this up, and hey, maybe I'll get to play some today. Doing these huge rules explanation parts, and you know, it's not like I'm giving you the whole rules. It really is taxing. That took me a whole day, basically.